All right, hey, what's going on? It's John. I'm a public theologian, and I was asked to comment on something earlier today, but I can't get a reply video in, so this will have to suffice. So, Jenna, I'm going to tag you here. Feel free to use this as you need. Now, I'm going to try really hard to get the comment up here in the corner. If I can't, the discussion revolved around Mark 1:15 and 1 Corinthians in a discussion of Paul's gospel and Jesus's gospel. And the commenter had said basically that Jesus's description of the gospel was before the cross, and Paul's description of the kingdom being at hand was after the cross. And I guess you could read that into it. That is a possible interpretation, but I would argue it's not the most direct and not the only interpretation of Mark 1:15. Now, the Greek verb there does mean has drawn near or has arrived or has become present in the present. It does not merely mean something will happen later or at some point. Now, truth in advertising, I personally believe theologically that Jesus is the incarnation or the embodiment of the kingdom of heaven. So that's going to slant my response. And I would argue that wherever Jesus liberated, healed, preached, spoke, wherever his presence was, the kingdom of God was there. So my argument would be that the cross and the resurrection did not break the kingdom into the world. The kingdom was already there. Now, I would argue in their own ways that they revealed and vindicated what had already arrived, but they weren't the harbinger event. And later, the commenter said, I'm just going to get the quote here: without sacrifice, there is no forgiveness and therefore no gospel. That reduces the gospel to one theory of atonement. And there are many of which substitutionary penal atonement is a later iteration of atonement. It is actually not older, but a newer atonement theory. And I would argue Jesus forgave sins before death, and he taught his disciples to pray for forgiveness during his lifetime. Without mentioning sacrifice. So there is an argument that forgiveness was being achieved before sacrifice. And if you're a literalist and you need somewhere to look at that, even Hebrews says that almost everything is purified with blood. Not everything. Now, in terms of the Christian experience, to be fair, I think an argument can be made that the cross is indispensable, but it should not become the lens that makes the rest of Jesus's life just simply disappear. Jesus said the law and the prophets hung on loving your neighbor and loving God, not on his death. So if the gospel needs a controlling lens, I would argue that lens would be the great commandment: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and then love your neighbor as yourself. Now, Paul emphasizes Jesus' death and resurrection because he is preaching and teaching post-Easter. So in that framework, Jesus is announcing God's reign, and then Paul is explaining its meaning through the risen Christ. And this is where critical scholarship is very important, and it's important to understand the context in which these things are written. 1 Corinthians, most scholars would agree, was written before Mark by years. So Paul would not have had access to Mark. But I do find it interesting that the writers of Mark may have had access to Paul and still wrote a different telling and a different and a slanted, different slant of the gospel than Paul. And last thing to say is this: the gospel is not merely that Jesus died. It is that God's kingdom is present in this life. And it is present in the life, teachings, and death of Jesus Christ. So hopefully, Jenna, I have appropriately upset everyone. The last thing I'll say is it is disheartening how many men think they need to mansplain everything to you. But have a day.